casualties of war. I mean, innocent civilians were slaughtered in the Twin Towers for what, I don't know, and I really don't care what the freaking motives were. The fact is that buildings were destroyed and individual lives were obliterated, right? And they were not, and specifically they were civilians, right? It was direct intentful targeting of civilian population. That's unforgivable in my book. So I'm gonna let you know that right now where I stand. That's unforgivable on any level. That cannot be condoned. That's a huge security breach. It's a huge security breach. But the idea is there's an inherent vulnerability in the building itself, right? And that inherent vulnerability in the building itself was realized in the attack. Is there a direct then implication to the national intelligence community? Of course, there's some implication. But are you telling me then that the resolve should have been within the intelligence community, barring lapses? And I've read all this stuff about interpreters not being able to do X, Y, Z, and this is what happened in the blame game and the finger pointing, and it was this one thing why that occurred. There is no one-to-one. It wasn't the case that there was this one lapse in intelligence and that led to the towers falling. I mean, there might be, but and that's more colloquial, right? But the idea is, and the public doesn't really know, but the idea is, in terms of intelligence can't protect everything. The goal of intelligence can't be the security of the nation and every individual and every citizen and every building and every system in the nation. You would exhaust your intelligence possibilities. It's not possible. There will be vulnerabilities, there will be systemic threats, and what we need to do is we need to be able to make a very key distinction, right? We need to be able to we, intelligence community, need to be able to recognize what things are at risk and what things potentially might elicit threats. Two totally different things, right? There was an inherent risk in the building being attacked prior to anyone conception. I mean, and we knew that the Twin Towers were targets from early 90s, from probably mid 90s, right? So we knew that there was a target. We knew that people were interested, but no one conceptualized. No one conceptualized using planes to do it, right? Everybody thought bottom up, not top down, right? So the approach was bottom up approach, but I would imagine that engineers constructed, and I mean, this is going to take me on another tangent, but I think it's, for engineering possibilities. I'm not an engineer, I don't know anything about engineer, blah, blah, blah. But I would imagine that engineers assumed in the construction of the building that someone might want to blow up the building and fortify the base, if you will. Right? So that the actual construction of the building was built in such a manner that it was to fortify the base. It was precisely that fortification that was used against the building, right? Plane crashes in, base is disrupted, things blow up, everything falls to the ground. So in terms of risk, there's an inherent risk in any building being attacked. Are you saying that the intelligence community is to minimize to zero risk? Of course not. What the intelligence community is charged with, that's more maybe security. Security, one aspect of the intelligence community. Security might want to mitigate against risk. We know this because when you hear security, we also can apply security in terms of sort of insurance-based security, right? And the idea is, if you are at, just to prove the point, right? If you are at risk for heart disease, you're not going to be insured. Why? Because your risk, the inherent risk within insuring, this might be changing because of all types of politics, but this is just a sort of canonical example. If insuring you is going to be a financial burden to the insurer because you have tremendous, I don't know, pre-existing blah, 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 you might not be susceptible for insurance. Now, granted, I recognize as soon as I say my example, that just makes me sound so American. And I know that won't go well over in Europe, so all my European colleagues, please forgive me for my crassness, but you can't fault me for how I was indoctrinated in this system, so I think about insurance liability in that form. I know that's changing, and it should change, but you get the idea. A threat is different from a risk, right? If we're talking about, well, I think I'm jumping ahead because I think the next thing is, so security frames the way in which we think, and I anticipated the next section, which was number 3. So this is security frames the ability of security, SEC, to frame, if I could write today. And then number 3 is going to be threat/risk difference. The difference between threat and risk, which is what we're discussing now, right? So let me just read it and then get back to what I was saying. It is critical to make, at this foundational level, the distinction between risks and threat, right? You have to be able to know the distinctions between the two. Threat is not a risk is not a threat, but both of which facet parts can be incorporated into a greater understanding of security and then intelligence. So theoretically, risk and threats are not the same. What is the distinction then, right, between a risk and a threat? So if I wanted to look at the differences, and I'm not going to itemize all of these now, THREATS. In terms of a risk, I did a book which, sort of egregiously promote on the nature of genocidal intentionality, on the nature of genocidal intent. I published a book on intent. I spent quite a bit of time conceptualizing intent, so much so that I wrote a book exclusively on intent. Very, very sort of abstract. The idea of intent is itself abstract. But it factors heavily into this discourse on the distinction between risk and threat. Because the defining, it's not sufficient, but the defining characteristic which demarcates risk from threat is intent. Right? The idea between risk and threat is that threat is an intended harm. Right? There is an intentional desire to harm. Right? So that when we talk about a threat, and a threat manifests as a consequence of an intent to inflict harm. Right? To be technical. So, INT, intent to harm. Risk doesn't really probably have anything to do with intent. It's devoid of intent. There is an inherent susceptibility to destruction. There is this inherent susceptibility to some negative consequence, but it's not really about harm. Right? The idea is, if there is any harm, it would, well, no, there really isn't any harm. You could conceptually push it, but I don't want to push it here because it's more sort of philosophical, blah, 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 and doesn't directly apply to really anything in intelligence. It's more sort of semantics. But the idea is not about, right? This does not pertain, intent. Intent does not factor. So when we're talking about a threat, we're talking about external threat, or we're talking about threat assessment. In terms of talking about threat assessment, what you're really talking about is, well, one of two things. If the threat isn't a product of a rival intelligence community, and it's just the threat from, random shooter on the street or what have you, then you do traditional intelligence work to mitigate that threat. And you can fill in how the mitigation unfolds. If, however, the external threat is a product, or could potentially be a product of an intentional design from a rival intelligence community, then you need to do counterintelligence to mitigate that threat, mitigate that potential harm. Why? Because there is the intent to harm. So the idea is, and this is what I think was, not what I think, this is what was extremely novel about my publication on genocidal intent, is that you can't really talk about securing if you're not contemplating intentfully destroying. Right? The whole idea of securing, and now this part of intelligence would be held accountable in terms, this specific bit on security is directly associated with intelligence, which is intelligence has to assume, this is undeniable, and intelligence community has to assume the responsibility for conceptualizing the vulnerability of its systems, of its infrastructure, of its people, of its XYZ. It can't be the case that you say, oh, we didn't know that that was vulnerable. You can say, okay, we knew it was vulnerable, but we didn't know it would be attacked in the manner that it was attacked.